All right, we are at harm reduction. So this is really the heart of what this whole education is about. It's about harm reduction, right? And you may not know exactly what that means in this context, but if you just look at harm reduction, right? Reducing harm, right? And that's and harm reduction is a few different things that we'll talk about. Number one, it's a philosophy. Number two, it's a specific intervention. And three, it's like a public health policy or approach, right? So it's all of these things rolled into one. Now, I'm going to read the definition from the Harm Reduction Network of what they say. So harm reduction is a set of practical strategies intended to reduce the negative consequences of high-risk behaviors, such as over-drinking or drug use. Harm reduction is a non-judgmental approach that attempts to meet people where they are at with their drinking or drug use. Instead of demanding perfect abstinence, this pragmatic approach is supportive of anyone who wishes to minimize the harm associated with a high-risk behavior such as drinking or drug use. Harm reduction accepts that high-risk behaviors such as recreational alcohol intoxication are part of the world and works to minimize their harmful effects rather than simply ignore or condemn them. Harm reduction does not attempt to force people to change in ways in which they do not choose for themselves. Harm reduction is a compassionate approach whose primary concern is the increased well-being of its constituency. Moreover, by overwhelming body of evidence, it shows that it works. So, breaking that down. So really, harm reduction is about taking things that are high in risk in nature, in this case alcohol, drugs, but it could be anything, like driving is high risk. Even things like sex are high risk, right? There are potential for harm, right? So so the intervention part of it is saying, all right, we are going to work, we're going to do counseling, we're going to do goals, we're going to do, so this in itself is like a harm reduction intervention so that you don't have as many consequences or any from the high-risk behavior of drinking, right? That would be an intervention. A public health policy of harm reduction would be, making certain things legal, supporting such as like a syringe exchange, right? A lot of controversy there, right? But to say, all right, we're going to give away clean needles to folks who are at high risk of HIV to reduce the prevention. So we're going to actually make law that it's okay to give people clean needles, right? Which brings a lot of people into an uproar, right? And it's understandable as to why that is. You're just going to give people needles, but I worked in one of these exchanges at an internship there, and the guy who ran it said to me, he's like, if we prevent just one case of spreading of HIV, just one, it'll pay for this 3 times over, right? So the public health cost of treating somebody, who has something like HIV or, as just one example, or the cost it would be if somebody gets in a drunk driving accident, the cost of their family, right? All of these things make it worth it to invest in this policy. Right, so there's the intervention, the policy, and then the philosophy, which they talked about there, is that we're going to approach it in this way, that we're going to work with people, that we're going to meet them where they are at. We're not going to try to push anything on them. We're going to be compassionate. Right? That's the philosophy around harm reduction itself. So, it's a very all-encompassing thing. Now, what isn't harm reduction, right, and this is where there's a little controversy when you get into my field, is taking, well, and I'm not even saying this isn't harm reduction, but taking a purely an abstinence-based approach would kind of be the opposite. Let's say when it just comes to drug and alcohol use, right? Now, abstinence is a form of harm reduction because if you don't use, then nothing bad's going to happen, presumably. But the more traditional way of treating alcohol and drug addiction or problems is through abstinence, saying, look, like if you have a drinking problem, then you probably just shouldn't drink, right? I mean, it's unrealistic you're going to be able to control it. Every time you drink, something terrible happens, and therefore you should probably just be abstinent because that's just the way addiction works in the brain disease element, right? Is that true? Sure. Is harm reduction or what they saying true? Yeah. How can both these things be true? Well, just like anything else, just like a diet or a certain approach, not every approach is right for everybody, right? There are some people that absolutely, a harm reduction approach, may not be the most appropriate. Now, that's not to say that if someone's like really bad off with addiction, maybe it's like I think like people on both ends of the spectrum. If you're far on the end of you're really bad off in addiction, or if you're like just kind of getting started and having, like, these are probably the sweet spot of where harm reduction is going to work best, right? It's okay across the realm, because it's like if someone's really bad, be like, okay, hey, we're going to do harm reduction, you know, to keep you alive and keep your life as good as possible. Then hopefully maybe you'll get into an abstinence mode and really flourish. Not that people don't if they're not fully abstinent, right? Or someone who's like, you know, to say who's maybe early on in the process of having alcohol or drug abuse, to say right away, you know what, like especially with like teenagers, you know what, you're abstinent, you can never drink or use again. Anything else to the contrary is just not going to be acceptable, right? Probably not going to be super helpful there too, nor is that really realistic, right? So I think there's kind of, it's just, and that's what we did, like when any of us counselors gave you an assessment, that's what we're looking at, is what's going to be most appropriate. Do we need to send you to detox right now, or do we just have you walk out of here and say this was all a big misunderstanding, right? And so if you're doing this course, it's likely, now we do have people do this course who have substance use disorder, especially if you're doing more of the program. If you're doing, so I mean, if you're doing the course, if you have a substance use disorder, you know, but if you're doing this, it's most likely because we thought that harm reduction is more appropriate. Now, a lot of you all were going to do a break from substances and make that a challenge, that maybe you don't have to not use ever again the rest of your life and go to meetings and all that kind of stuff. Maybe, you know, and that's probably why we're recommending this, is that, you know, there may be a chance that you're going to go back to drinking at some point, whether it's now or later, right? So, again, you know, I give that background to show you, you know, the different approaches that can be taken and why we look at things from the way that we do, and how you can use harm reduction, and how you could decide what's right for you as well as you work with your counselor. Again, we can only make suggestions and recommendations and give reasons why. So, you know, a few other things about harm reduction that they say are that anyone who is working to drink or, you know, be safer in general is doing harm reduction. Anyone who's trying to limit the amount, anyone who's pursuing a goal of moderate drinking or even abstinence is also doing harm reduction, as we said. What else? So it's important to reduce immediate harms versus eventual harm. So basically, it's like if I'm smoking cigarettes and doing heroin, I probably want to quit heroin first because that's more likely to kill me right away than smoking cigarettes, which will kill me later, right? So having a hierarchy. And yeah, so also part of that hierarchy would be like, let's say, having, you know, stop, you know, drinking and driving. If I'm doing that every day, I'm going to stop that before, you know, the health implications of something else. So harm reduction strategies, right? So I think this is really important one. I mean, some of these are pretty obvious, maybe, or you know, or just seem quite intuitive, but not always easy to do, and it's not always something that you're going to be thinking about, especially if you've never had consequences from alcohol before, or when you're drunk, you just tend to make bad decisions, right? You know, some of these may seem pretty straightforward, and they are. But before we move on with that, I want you to think about this. I break down behaviors, let's just say behaviors in general, not just drinking or whatever, using behaviors, into two major categories, right? One is mindful, so an approach, a mindful approach, or a reactive or impulsive approach. Okay, so I want you to think about that for a second. A mindful approach versus a reactive approach. What would you imagine the difference to be, right? What in your mind is the difference between a mindful and a reactive approach? You could pause for a sec, think about it. Well, you know, to me, a mindful approach versus a reactive approach. So mindful, so mind. I'm putting my mind to something, right? I'm thinking about it. In another section with the reward, we talked about deeper parts of the brain versus more frontal parts of the brain, right? The more human part, the more thoughtful, cognitive part is the front, and the deeper part is that midbrain, right? Emotional, reactive part. So mindful is I'm putting thought. I'm being mindful. I can't go around and put thought to everything all day, right? Otherwise, it would take up too much bandwidth. I have to think about, I am grabbing my spoon. The spoon is made of this, and I'm going to mindfully put my spoon in the cereal. You don't have to do it. You could just kind of go on, reaction and just eat your cereal. It's not a big deal. But for certain things, like if you're going out drinking or doing something high risk, or you're doing something where there's potential consequences, like talking to your wife, you may want to be a little bit more mindful about what you say because it could come back to bite you in the ass later. So that's taking a more mindful approach to something versus a reactive, which is I'm just going on instinct, gut, emotion, reacting. I'm impulsive. I'm just kind of doing whatever I'm feeling like doing, which again is going to be more likely to get me in trouble. So most of the time when people go out drinking, right, you're not really thinking about it. You're like, oh my God, I'm partaking in a high-risk behavior, and therefore I better take a mindful approach. Well, usually you don't think like that until something bad happens. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, actually something bad can happen when I drink. Therefore, maybe I should take a more mindful approach. Therefore, I should put more thought into what I'm doing and make more of an effort to go out and have a safe night. So if you forget everything else, just remember that, like just putting more thought, having a plan. All of that so all these fit under the realm of mindfulness, right? All these specific strategies. So like the first one is a safe drinking, plan your intox day. They're very clinical here. Your intox day, so basically just means day you're drinking, getting drunk, right? So planning it, right? So I think all of this is going to fall under to that making a plan. So here's a bunch of skills. So you could take some of these skills and put it together and make a plan. Here's how I'm going to get home tonight. So this is a skill in itself, is making a plan and encompassing some of these other skills. So going into the night with a plan for it. Now, one of the good reasons for this too is because otherwise, if you make the decisions beforehand and you think about it, it's going to be easier to remember when you're out in the jungle getting drunk, and you're going to remember easier, like, oh wait, how am I supposed to get home? Oh yeah, instead of having to plan it while you're drunk, right? Because the drunker you get, the worse your decision making. So make those decisions beforehand. Now, of course, you could get drunk and override it and be like, screw it, I'm driving home. I'm going to go find my keys and make it happen. You could go out of your way to do that. But if you have everything set up beforehand, it's much easier. Making those decisions when you're sober. And even too, that comes down to how many drinks am I going to have. I know if I drink that magic number 6, I'm off to the races and bad stuff happen. If I stick to 4, 5 at the worst, I'm usually okay, right? So when you're in that moment, you're like, oh, okay, hey, I'm at 4. So there's all these ways that you could plan that, and even just doing something that simple could help. And I tell people too, when you think about it, right? I want you to think about 2 people, right? There's 2 guys, and they're going to go out. They're going to have the same night, and one goes into it and he thinks, you know what? I'm going to go out. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to be safe. That's my intention. The other person just goes out and just acts willy-nilly. Who's more likely to stay safe, right? Probably just the guy who even thought about it, who put intention to it, who just made it a goal that he didn't even make a plan. He just said, I'm going to go and I'm going to be safe. He had that intention, right? I'm sure that guy's more likely than this guy, right, to have a good, safe night. So something to think about too, just as an overarching theme of as we do this. So the next one is driving, phoning. So part of that plan is a ride, right? One of the biggest reasons that people come to me is because of a drinking and driving incident, right? And so if you're drinking and driving, if you're drinking, and to figure out how you're going to get around, do you have, where are you going to go? Do you have money loaded on Uber? I mean, what do are you ready to go? So you have a ride set instead of having to figure it out later, whereas you're going to be in a worse state of mind to make a big decision. Drinking at home. So these next couple are some of my favorites here. So drinking at home. So they say here that the statement that drinking alone is a sign of alcoholism is a myth. Drinking at home alone can be much safer than going out drinking in public if your intent is to get intoxicated. Well, how true that is, right? Now, maybe it's debatable whether you're drinking at home alone all the time, and maybe that is a sign of alcoholism, I'm sure, in some ways. But, they make a good point that, usually when bad things happen, it's not when I'm in my house. Usually when people come to me and say, like, I was in my house, and then all of a sudden, like, the police barged in, it's like, no, usually you're out in the public and in the jungle, and, something bad happens out there. Now, granted, you could be at home, you could slip in the bathtub, or you could get into a domestic dispute. Sometimes that'll happen. maybe more likely that one. But really, like most of the time, like bad things happen outside the house. So if you want to drink and you want to get a little drunk, maybe, just stay home. Another good one is going out with a friend. Now, I tell everybody this. Everybody has friends that are a bit more wild than them and friends that are a bit tamer than them, right? So unless you're like super, super wild and no one can compete with you, right? We're usually somewhere in the middle. We got our like little crazier friends and we got our little tamer friends. So it's like, so if I'm really trying to make changes and I'm trying to do better, right, I'm probably better off hanging with those friends who are, not going to egg me on to like, do beer bongs and shots and play beer pong and like whatever the hell else, right? My crazy friends from college trying to relive the glory days, right? Probably better not to hang with them. It's like we're the sum of the 5 people we hang out with most. And if I'm hanging out with these guys, I'm more going to be more like them versus these guys. Not to say we don't hang out with the wild guys ever, but right now, if I just got a DWI or something and I'm trying to make changes, I'm trying to drink less, probably better I don't hang out with those guys for a while. It kind of reminds me of this joke, one of my favorite George Carlin jokes. And he says that, on the road, he's like, people who drive slower than you are idiots, and people who drive faster than you are assholes, and nobody drives the same as you. No one drives the same speed as you, right? Because that's even more annoying, right? So it kind of reminds me of that a bit. Right, so some of these strategies are more about the secondary effects, right? So, with alcohol, I'm more likely to make, let's say, a bad decision when it comes to like a hookup or having sex or something, because there's, as we saw before, there's more chances of sexual assaults, STDs, that kind of thing. So how do I prevent those kind of things from happening? Knowing that that's a possibility, so I bring condoms out and, I don't want any unplanned pregnancies or anything else that I can't get rid of. So, another one is like certain vitamins, staying well hydrated, things to like reduce the possibility of hangovers and what those cause. Here they talk about that mindset we just talked about before of like just having a safe mindset and avoiding impulse drinking. So again, that's kind of more of the mindfulness, kind of in the same category. So this one is like fairly simple, but just kind of like having goals. So reducing count and schedule. So like you have to start somewhere. Okay, if I'm drinking 10 drinks a day, and if I drink 9, that's better than 10, right? If that's where I got to start, that's where I got to start. Now, if you're drinking that many a day, you quit too quick, you may have withdrawals, so you may not want to do that. But if that's where you're at, and okay, drink 9. If I drink every day, all right, I'm going to drink 6 out of 7 days. So simple things like that are just good places to start. And you're doing harm reduction, and it is worth doing that, even if it doesn't seem super like a big step. I talked about earlier, those baby steps, moving mountains. So this one's pretty obvious. Avoid the eye opener. Yeah, you probably don't want to wake up and have a drink first thing in the morning. Like, probably not a good idea. So I'd listen to them there, but I'm no expert. Blackout. So I think this is more along the lines of reducing those more severe types of intoxication, right? So blackout is like when your mind is asleep but your body's still awake. It's a very dangerous combination, right? You don't remember what had happened. You make really horrible decisions, right, that are going to affect you. Maybe be a little embarrassed the next day. But really it's more about avoiding acute intoxication effects. And for some of the reasons we talked about before, like if you have enough to eat, it lowers your chances of spiking your blood alcohol if you're well hydrated, right? If your sleep schedule is screwed up, if you can get enough sleep and you drink, it could throw you into that state of sleep deprivation and make you more likely to black out. So it's really just about how do I avoid getting to those really acute levels of intoxication that really have a significantly negative impact. Okay, so now that we've gone through this section, I think one of the most important things is to make a harm reduction plan. So everyone who goes through this section is going to do this. If you're doing just the education, this is probably just going to be the next thing and one of the only things that you're going to do, right, is create a harm reduction plan. So one of the things I want you to do is I want you to go to this HAMS network and just check it out for yourself. See if there's other skills on there, other articles, anything that stands out to you. But really what I want you to do next is create a harm reduction plan. So what that means is looking at, like, kind of the past too, what had happened. So how did I get into this mess? What were the mistakes that I made? Then looking at, here's where I'm at now, and here's my harm reduction plan moving forward. Maybe that harm reduction plan is like, hey, I'm going to be abstinent. Well, then how are you going to be abstinent based on these other things that you've learned or are going to learn here? What am I going to do to be abstinent? What made it harder before? And don't just put, well, I didn't want it before, now I do. But think about some strategies of, like, here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to avoid these situations. I'm going to try to do more of these healthy things. So kind of look at that and then write down the specific skills that you're going to use moving forward. Now maybe if you say, hey, if I do end up drinking again, then here is what that's going to look like. Here are the skills I'm going to use so it doesn't happen again. So make that like 1 to 2 pages, single space of a harm reduction plan. And you'll go over that with your counselor. So you could do that one before, you could do that right now, or you can meet with your counselor once and then do it after, and then they'll sign the completion for you, and you could go over that another time. So, yep, you go ahead and get started on that.